Not sure how folks in Connecticut heard about it and sort of reached out. And so I'm grateful for that. I think that the information in this slide deck and what I'm going to be talking about today not only is specific to Massachusetts, I've added and layered in a lot of the Connecticut demographics. But, we are two communities that are sort of almost coexisting, and people are sort of going back and forth. As a matter of fact, my primary care provider is in Connecticut. My husband works in Connecticut. My niece works in Connecticut. And oftentimes in our spaces, it's almost like we're talking about one community. So I'm again excited to be presenting, grateful for the invitation. There's a lot of material that I'm going to be covering today. And so I want to honor when there's thoughts or questions. I try to make it as interactive as possible. I encourage you that as you're listening, if you have reflections or thoughts that you want to share, please feel free to put them into the chat. My goal is that we will have enough time at the end to be able to have a Q&A. And again, there's a few pieces that are interactive with questions. There's a group conversation that I'm hoping to have. And so again, I will do my best, but as Holly mentioned, I've shared the slide. None of this information is unique to me, right? I happen to bring experience and expertise based on my years working in the field, also based on who I am, right? My personal experience as a Latina, as a Puerto Riqueña, living in Massachusetts, and so authentically based on my work, a lot of this is my reflection, but a lot of it is information that's out there, right? Research that's out there. So none of it is exclusive to me. I don't own it. And so I'm happily passing along the slides for your reference, and then for you to go and do some additional digging if you so choose to. There's some citations in the end of the slide deck, and then there's also some links in terms of resources, not only in Massachusetts, but also in Connecticut as well. And so here are some of the objectives for today. Again, I will be talking a little bit about the population, not only in Massachusetts and Connecticut, but in the US. And I think that we can't begin to have a conversation about how do we work with any population without really understanding the demographic and really taking a look, not only locally, but across the country, because the Hispanic-Latine community is, again, one that's very mobile, one that oftentimes seeks to be in La Patria, in the homeland, but have to oftentimes stay in this country because of need. And so we want to make sure that we understand that full snapshot. There's also social determinants of health that we need to consider when talking about the population. This is around what strategies to pull from, right? How to engage. And you can't do that without understanding some of the social determinants of health. There are many strengths that the community has, but there's also a lot of opportunities. And so as providers, how do we tap into some of that? How do we pull from our experience, but learn from others as well? I'll talk a little bit about cultural elements, values that the Latino population brings, and how do we, again, as providers, connect. And that includes, right, someone like me. I think that there's this misconception out there that because I'm Latina, as a professional, I can relate and provide care to all Latinos. And there's a lot of diversity in our community. And so, my experience as a Puerto Riqueña, born in Puerto Rico, raised here in the US, is very different from a sister of mine or friend that maybe came into this country as a migrant, whose background is Mexican, who has certain lived experiences and fears and moments in my community that I can't relate to. And so there's this assumption that it's a language thing. If you speak Spanish, you can serve the community. And it's much deeper than that. It's really understanding the fabric and the history and what the traumas are that many of the people in the community live with. And then we'll talk about some, again, available resources in terms of approaches and maybe even some workforce opportunities as well. So again, I mentioned you can't do a training around engaging the community without understanding that demographic. And so I wanted to quickly kind of review a little bit of that. Some of this data, right, we're in 2025, it's slightly outdated, but not much. The trend continues to follow the same pattern. And so, you know, in 2020, 60, the Hispanic population grew from 2010 to 2022 to 63.6 million. And so that is like amazing when I consider that, because oftentimes Latinos and many people of color in the community are referred to as the minority. And that is not a minority number. That is a very large number. And so it's our responsibility as providers, as leaders within the community, to say, you know what, this is not just a migration thing. This is not people who are here temporarily. These are people who live in this country, who are citizens of this country, who work in this country, who have children in this country. And so how do we better, again, serve and understand and create inclusive services? You know, it baffles me, and you know, that 1 out of every 5 people in the U.S. identifies as a Hispanic or Latino. You know, that's more than half the U.S. population. That growth, more than half of that came from the Hispanic Latino population. And so that is an important thing to understand. I think that many people know that, you know, a lot of Latinos live in this country. Not many understand the demographics and what that looks like. So here's a little question, and feel free to write this in the chat. Of the Hispanic Latino population in Connecticut, what ethnic group do you think is the greatest percentage of the population? Again, I'll take a peek at the chat. You know, do you think it's Colombian? Do you think it's Dominican, Puerto Rican, Mexican? I'm seeing Puerto Rican. I'm seeing Puerto Rican. Dominican, Mexican. Okay. So for those who answered Puerto Rican is the answer, right? The largest percentage of that demographic from the Connecticut population is Puerto Rican, followed by Dominican. So whoever said Dominican, right, that's the second largest subgroup of the population in Connecticut. And actually, as a matter of fact, 30% of the growth in Connecticut was 30%, much higher than the growth across the country, which was 23%. So the growth of the Hispanic Latino population in Connecticut is significant. It continues to grow, and so is in Massachusetts, and again, similar Hampden County or New England states as well. So this is a little bit of a closer look as well, and I think that this is important because geography matters. We're talking about Connecticut, we're talking of Massachusetts, New England states, and in our area, Puerto Ricans tend to top that demographic. But if we're looking across the country, that is not the case, right? There are different areas and different demographics, and across the United States, almost 60% of the demographic is of Mexican origin, right? And depending on where you are, you're going to understand that a little bit differently. The second largest population also across the US continues to be the Puerto Rican population. And so followed by, right, our brothers and sisters in Cuba, Salvador, Santo Domingo, Guatemala, Colombia, right, and other Central American and South American countries. So lots and lots of diversity. This is just a quick snapshot if we're looking again at geography and the US population across the country, and we're looking at the Northeast. You can see the dominant demographic is Puerto Rican and Dominicans, right? That's the experience for us. New Jersey, New York, one of the largest populations across the country. We have Philadelphia, Boston, and so in the Northeast, Puerto Rican and Dominican tend to lead. When we're looking at the Midwest, that demographics changes significantly, right? You're looking at, again, Mexican primarily leading, followed by Puerto Rican, which is a much, much smaller percentage, and then it goes on and on as well. Same with the South. Again, very interestingly, when we look at Miami, the strong demographic subpopulation there is Cuban, right? And if you know a little bit of that history, there's reasons for that. But it shifts depending on where you are. When you're going and looking at the West, again, we're talking LA, Phoenix, it switches back to Mexican. So it's primarily Mexican, but depending on your location. And again, what we know is people move and go back and forth. Families move. Everybody's looking for sort of the best opportunity possible. And it's not uncommon for people to come and go across some of these states. Now, here's another question. Of the New England states, which state do you think has the highest percentage of the Hispanic Latino population? Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, or Massachusetts? And again, feel free to write that in the chat. Some say Massachusetts, some say Connecticut. I'm going to give a few others. So you guys are almost split on this. Mass, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. All right, you guys know your stuff. So in terms of the largest percentage, Connecticut tops it, with close to half the population being of Hispanic. Nearly half the Hispanic Latino population in Connecticut is Puerto Rican. But the largest demographic of Hispanics across New England is also in Connecticut, followed by Massachusetts, followed by Rhode Island, and I'll show a few other slides that will represent that. I believe it's about 17% of the population. So here's a little bit of a visual. Massachusetts sits at 13%, a little bit over 13%, where Connecticut sits now at about 18%. Rhode Island, 17%. You have strong population in New Hampshire as well, Vermont, and even Maine, right? So when we look at the New England states, again, Connecticut still tops it. And I will reiterate that the population grew by 30% between 2010 and 2020, and that is higher, again, than the national increase, which was 23%. So thank you guys, right, for your participation in the chat. I appreciate that. I think it helps you stay connected. It's really hard. I'm a personable person. And you'll understand how those values lead our work and how we show up. And so I've learned to appreciate the virtual space, but I love to see people and their faces and to be able to engage. So I can appreciate when you guys engage. Here's a little bit of a demographic. Again, I mentioned Massachusetts, this training I originally designed for. I think it was important for me to leave this in because, again, we're so closely related. However, I did add the statistics for Connecticut as well. But here you have a little bit of these are the top 10 Latino subpopulations in Massachusetts. Again, Puerto Ricans continue to hit the top across the board, followed by Dominicans, and then the rest of our community that, again, there's still a very dynamic, diverse, vibrant community of so many that represent the Latino populations. Here are the top 10 subpopulations in Connecticut. And again, and if you look at the percentages, they're almost identical. It's almost like half the population. Puerto Ricans, followed by Dominicans, followed by Mexican. That changes a little bit from the statistics in Massachusetts. And then again, the continuation of other subpopulations in Connecticut as well. So what does all of that mean? And I think it's important to understand that because there's sort of two pieces of this conversation, right? When we look at this parallel, that means that there's a lot of opportunity in terms of engaging the population, of how the population shows up and engages as well. How do we show up in the workspace? How do we show up in leadership? I think it's important to take a look at that because there's a lot of strength there. And so, one of the things that is important to recognize that the population it's a very young population. So that really influences workforce sustainability in Massachusetts. And again, I didn't get a chance to do the numbers for Connecticut, but I know that they're very similar. 29% pretty much of the population are under 18, while 21% are whites that are 65 and older. And again, we have a very large baby boomer population that is getting ready to exit the workforce. And those positions are often, again, going to be creating a steady pipeline of future workforce providers, caregivers, civic leaders, education, healthcare, all of these public sectors. We have strong Latino representation, but we'll continue to see that growing. And I think that that is important because there's still many other factors when we look at equities and social determinants of health and health disparities that we need to continue to work towards so that we can provide better care. There's an immense influence based on the voting power that, again, has impacted inclusive governments and cultural responsible systems. I mean, here I am doing a training around gambling to be able to engage the Latino population. That is amazing, right? People are being intentional with how we show up and how we serve. In terms of consumer power, culturally relevant products, lots and lots of entrepreneurship and growing businesses. And again, having diversity in the workforce encourages us to be intentional, right? Intentional around equity, around community engagement, cultural enrichment, and social cohesion, right? Because it's not about identifying the differences. It's about talking as well. What are all of the commonalities and how have we worked together and how do we continue to support each other? And it's also known, and this is one of the ways that the community has influenced greatly as well, the professional sector, the clinical sector. A lot of the research shows that many of the trauma-informed, family-centered, equity-driven approaches in many organizations have been really pushed forward by leaders in our community, right? Because we've identified the need and we continue to bring that conversation to the table where oftentimes there wasn't representation. And so we're making, I think, significant strides in terms of moving forward. Now, here's a question, right, before I go into the rest of the statistics that I wanted to briefly touch on, or just kind of have an out loud conversation. How do cultural values, family dynamics, and I'm going to move this around because I can't see my screen, or financial stress influence the way that people in your community view gambling, either as entertainment, opportunity, or risk? And again, if you're comfortable with coming off mute and raising your hands and sharing a comment, I would love to hear from you. If you're more comfortable writing a quick comment in the chat, I would appreciate that. But just sort of think, how do you think that cultural values and family dynamics and the significant financial stress that many people in our community face, not just the Latina population, impacts how people view gambling? And again, either as entertainment, opportunity, or risk. And Holly, I'll look to you in case you see someone's hand who wants to speak. But again, I encourage, if you're not comfortable speaking, please write it in the chat. And I think that this is a really important conversation because it touches on, how do we work on prevention? How do we work on treatment, engagement, any of those phases, if we don't understand what is driving people's behaviors, right? And so I think we see this all of the time. We just don't always reflect on it in that way.
James has a comment in the chat.
Awesome, thank you. Opportunity in the form of hope. Yes, James. Do you mind sharing a little bit more if you're comfortable?
I just think that a lot of people in areas, especially where they're underserved, disadvantaged, look at gambling as a way of hope, a way out, so to speak. And I find it interesting. I do methadone maintenance counseling, and part of the monthly session is doing an assessment on gambling. And a lot of people say, no, I don't gamble. But when I ask them, have you ever bought a lottery ticket? Oh, yeah, all the time. But they don't consider that gambling. They say, well, I don't go to the casino. So I think a lot of times people don't understand what gambling is because they just think it's the casino or, racetracks and, sports betting. They don't consider playing cards or bingo or buying lottery tickets as gambling.
You just did the presentation, James, right? Spot on. It's exactly that. It's sort of what's socially acceptable, what is okay within our communities that it's not seen as high risk behavior. And how do we begin to educate and inform so that when people step out into any of the spaces where these activities are available, people are at least empowered with information so that they're making informed decisions, so that they have a plan for how to approach that. And then the element of hope, right? The financial struggle is very real across the country, but especially so for people in certain communities. And so oftentimes, every time that you see one of those huge, right, pots of money that are, in the lotto, this is my chance. And if I do it, I'm going to do this. I mean, people have planned out their entire lives based on this minute possibility of potentially winning, right? Because it's seen as a way, right? As a way out of poverty, as a way out of financial difficulties, etc. I'll take Joanna, and then I want to read the next comment on the chat as well.
I also think like in terms of entertainment, I come from a Latino household and I can just think back on getting together and always having some type of game involved, and even as children also being involved in those games, whether it was like bingo, dominoes, or card games, and then having the money aspect with it too. So it's something that's widely accepted and okay when there's a large group together. So
Yep.
it's seen as fun and entertaining, and we had a long week of work and responsibilities, and this is sort of that escapism.
I deserve this. I deserve this moment, right? I deserve this family share, and if you don't get together, then what's wrong with you? Like, what do you mean you don't want to do this? Like, this is how we have fun. This is how we get together, right? And I'm not saying that any of it is wrong per se, but without empowerment of information and knowledge, how then are folks able to understand the potential risk again and plan for it? And sort of those social expectations, that fiber that's built into how we show up and how we engage is really important. And so, Joanna, you gave up the second part of that presentation. So you guys are spot on. There's a few more comments. Entertainment, not going to talk about it. Or if it becomes a problem, if a problem arises because of gambling, yeah, there's also sort of that cultural belief that let's keep this private. That needs to stay in the home. Like, you don't mention it, we don't address it, we don't talk about it. And then, of course, yes, that correlation with alcohol and substance use and other pieces that may be part of that equation, right? It doesn't mean that it's part of it, but often associated. I mean, if you walk into a casino, you get to drink for free, right? And so there's a reason behind some of that, and what is offered in those spaces. And yes, shame and stigma, labels are not fun. No one wants to be labeled. And so thinking that if I say something, and that automatically is going to get turned into, wow, can you believe que el hijo de tal y tal and so son is this and so son is that? Or, I don't want to shame my husband. I don't want to shame my wife. No one wants to talk about someone they love with a potential concern or a question. And so how do we again destigmatize the conversation so that people are making intentional, informed decisions when engaging in any of this behavior, whether it be legal or illegal, as well. So thank you guys, right? Thank you for sharing, for your engagement. This is right before we can talk about further continue the conversation. We want to make sure that people understand gambling. I got the understanding from Holly and obviously from the shares that you guys have provided, that the fundamentals, right? You know what gambling is. Again, I've sort of highlighted different things. We have the Webster Dictionary. We have how the Massachusetts Office of Gambling Services defines it. We even have sort of, right, a statement from the Connecticut Clearinghouse on gambling disorder. And then we understand that, you know, gambling doesn't necessarily mean that I have a gambling addiction, right? You need to meet a very specific clinical criteria in order to be diagnosed, and for other resources and services to come into play. But at the end of the day, is right, it's people engaging in risk and stakes in any game with the hopes of winning, gaining something out of it. And there's that element of impact, right? Impact on self, impact on family, impact on social, financial, right? How does my engagement in my activity shows up in my day-to-day, right? Am I able to control it? Am I able to say, you know what, this weekend I'm not gonna go out and gamble and I'm fine, or I'm not gonna go out and gamble this weekend, maybe because I don't have any money, but I'm gonna be moody all weekend. I'm gonna be anxious. I'm not gonna be a happy person to be around, and no one else may know that that's the reason, right? People are just saying, like, I just don't get it, you know, please stay away from dad this week because he's not in a good mood, without knowing, well, what's the underlying factor in that lack of good mood, right? Because we define it as not in a good mood because we don't understand the risk factors. And so it's important to know and educate. I really appreciated when I did a little bit of research in Connecticut, some of the videos that are out there, both in English and Spanish, right? Because again, informing the communication and informing the community in language that they can relate to, not only language, but with visuals of people that they see themselves in, is really important. So it's not just taking a message and then translating it, is do I see myself in that person, right? Do I see a loved one in that person? That is really important when engaging the Latino community. Here's a few other pieces, right, around, again, increasing gambling awareness. The reality is about 85% of US adults have gambled at least once in their lives, 60% within the last year, right? And again, there's some form of legalized gambling in 48 states, including the District of Columbia. I think the only two without legalized gambling systems are Hawaii and Utah. And yet, you know, and also about 1% of the population is estimated to be able to meet severe gambling problem, right? Criteria for severe gambling problems. They may not meet full diagnostic criteria, but they definitely exhibit some of those symptoms and face negative consequences related to that behavior. And I think that's when we want to make sure that we're, again, understanding, providing information, and engaging people without shame and judgment, right? Just simply trying to understand. We also know that most adults who do choose to gamble do so responsibly, right? And are able to, you know, engage, have their fun, cut it off, they're good to go, don't need anything else. However, the one piece that I want to make sure that we understand, that although that percentage, right, only 1% of the population, to me, that's enough, that's significant. The other factor to this is the average population doesn't face some of the social determinants of health and disparities that people in certain communities do, especially people in BIPOC communities, right? Especially people who are already dealing with systemic inequities, economic stressors, right? Lack of cultural responsive care. And so you add those layers to that percentage and the risk factor goes up. So although the risk is low across the board, it is not that low in our communities. And that's the piece that we want to make sure that we're keeping in mind. It's also important to know that advertisement and marketing in our communities is a lot higher. And you leverage, again, images and people that our community trusts to be able to say, like, hey, this is okay. You can do this. This is not problematic. You're actually going to be pretty cool if you do this. And people are also, many, especially young men, are targeted at an earlier age. And because of the social element of many gambling activities in our community, people engage in gambling at an earlier age, which naturally increases the risk for gambling behavior to become problematic. You also layer in other issues, substance use, mental health, other comorbidities, and again, the risks go up and up and up. So it isn't a low risk for the entire community. We need to look at demographics and populations and all of those pieces. So what are some of the types of gambling in the Latino communities? I can't recall if it was Joanna, James, right, mentioned, I growing up, this was very much a part of, I remember being a kid and playing bingo, and we loved playing bingo. And the table was full of quarters and pennies, and it was fun because you got to win money, and it engaged abuela and abuelo and mom and dad. It was a fun activity. Not once did it ever cross my mind, oh my God, this is gambling, because it represented fun in our household. And so again, at a younger age, certain people are already engaging in this behavior, not with any malice intent, right? You don't even know that that's what you're doing, but it is part of the fabric. It is there. There's cultural betting as well, often associated in many of our communities. Cockfighting has continued to decline, but it's still very present in Puerto Rico. It is a significant sport, and now it's actually a federal crime. And so now you're layering in the potential risk of, right, correctional systems getting involved, children getting connected to DCF, because if you're in a home where this has taken place, right, now you have other social agencies involved. So it's important to know that these things are still happening in our communities. Even though race betting in certain places is okay, there's different ways that you can do it. There's a lot of underground betting that happens in many of our communities. There's the informal gaming that I think was so, appropriately talked about earlier, right? That's sort of the fun stuff. I remember I played brica when I was a kid. I would have never associated it as something that was problematic. Dice playing is something that I still see every time I go to Puerto Rico, in the parks where there's dominoes that are being played, and again, it's sort of part of the cultural fabric. But when does it move from some of that informal stuff into something that can become problematic? And usually that measuring stick is when you're involving stakes, right? When you're involving money, when you're involving, I was talking to other people, right, about some of this stuff not that long ago, and they were remembering when they were younger how what they would play for was sneakers, and that Nike jacket that you have that I want, and that was how, people kept up with some of the things that they really enjoyed. So very common. The lottery and the scratch tickets, they're available in, again, many slot machines are still available in some of the local groceries and stores. Lotto is sort of, it's almost like it's set aside like if it was a bill in many of our communities. I was like, you know what, I may not have for the eggs and the leche and the main stuff, but I have that $20 to go play the lotto, and I had a dream, so I'm gonna go play that number. Or my grandchild was just born, we got to play that number. So it's almost very connected to all of even belief systems in terms of in our community. The bingo, right, some of the formal playing, casino gambling, and again, now we have access. Before in Massachusetts, people would go over to Connecticut to play at the casino, because even though we've had casinos in Massachusetts, they're more in the metro Boston area. They weren't accessible to the communities adjoining Connecticut, right? So Springfield, all of us in Western Mass, the go-to was Connecticut. But now you have a casino right in downtown Springfield. And so now we see a little bit of the shift from Connecticut coming into Springfield, because it's up about proximity, right? What's the closest to me? It's not necessarily what state I'm in. It might take me 15 minutes to get to the casino in Springfield versus an hour to get to the one in Connecticut, even though I live in Connecticut, right? So that's the thinking for a lot of people. And of course, raffles, bolita is sort of a form of lotto, but it's lotto that gets purchased by sort of the local person. Another memory of mine, right, is a gentleman in my community that used to be called Kike. He's since passed away, but he would knock on other doors and he would catch the numbers, and the moms and dads would say, play, 5 for me on this, and he would get a cut if someone wins, because not everybody had the mobility to get to a place where they can actually play. And this is not non-existent. Some of this still happens in many of our communities. And then we've also normalized a lot, sort of raffling and tickets. I mean, it's part of everything. Churches, schedule trips to the casinos, and kids, are often selling raffles for their sports events. And again, in a traditional way, maybe some of these things are not problematic, but in certain communities and for people that have certain behaviors, this can become problematic if we're not aware. And so as people become aware, they make changes to kind of adjust even the potential of exposure for some of the young adults in our communities. Just making sure I wasn't missing any comments from the chat. So again, also sports betting, online gambling, now that a lot of this is more sort of, again, formal, legalized. You have all of the popular apps. Again, you have, people that people associate with these apps. You have Canelo, you have comedians, you have all of these people that folks can identify. And sports are huge in many of our communities. Boxing in particular is huge in the Mexican, Puerto Rican, Dominican households. Whenever there's a fight, it's almost like the world shuts down and you have to be up and ready to see what's happening. Soccer, still also very prominent for some of our Central and South American brothers and sisters. So, depending on the subgroup, you're going to have different sports that people like to engage in, but they're very much a part of the fiber in our communities. So
Sandra,
yes.
There's a comment about highlight in the chat.
Okay.
Janet wrote, I grew up with an uncle who went to highlight a lot, and he lost a lot of money and would come home to my very angry aunt and got to the point where he would lie about he lost money. So I knew gambling could be risky, but a lot of people used to do that for fun.
Yeah.
Sort of
Thank you for
highlight.
that comment, Janet, right? And again, for sharing such a personal experience so that we can learn from it. Because yeah, and I'm sure that was a repeat experience, in many households, right? In the line and have to cover up. And then the impact on whether the bills are going to get paid that month or not. And again, these are things we remember growing up, but these are still very much the realities of many of the people that we service. They just have never talked about it or have never seen it as such, right? And more and more and more, we're creating spaces, and again, public service announcements and engaging the right resources so that message hits the community. But it's not very, very, it's not a common topic, right? Unless you have someone in the household that works in a related or relatable field and is constantly, you become almost like the announcement person for your family, educating and informing and connecting, not only within your family, but the entire community. Because everybody knows so-and-so's daughter is a social worker. You can reach out to her. Even if she doesn't have time, she's going to end up supporting that dynamic, because that's another way that we often show up, right? Collective matters, community matters. And so I may not be able to take it on, but if someone reaches out, I'm going to say, okay, give me a moment, I'll attend to that. And so informally, many people do seek help. They just don't seek it formally. They're not going into clinics. They're not going into certain settings. They're going in through behind the scenes, through the person who knows the person that knows that this person has information that could help, right? Through the pastor or the church leader, or right, someone else that knows someone that is in recovery that does work. And so, that's an addiction, so that person's going to know, right? And so that's how many people connect. So what's low risk gambling? And again, many people do engage in some of this. It's for recreation only, not to win. You understand that with time off, people lose, right? You engage in gaming socially, so with family and friends, You're not going to the casino by yourself and spending hours or spending the entire weekend, right? There's safety in numbers. And when you're not by yourself and you're with community, then you may not think you have a problem, but your community is going to have no problem saying, hey, I think you should stop. You said you were going to spend 50 and you've spent 100. Like you've lost, right? You've lost the ability to control how much you're going to spend. So community also becomes a safety net. Gambling with time that's limited, saying, you know what, I'm going to go to the casino, I'm going to go for entertainment because we know that there's other events in a place like that. But I'm going to stay for this X period of time. And after that, I'm going home, right? Because the longer you stay, the higher the probability that you may engage in more and more, or that you may be betting or using more money. Having a predetermined amount of money to play or lose, right? And understand that information doesn't make you a better gambler. This isn't like strategy, right? And there's sometimes commercials and people say, oh no, there's professionals that do this and they know and they've learned and this really isn't strategy. And so that's that in and of itself is risky, right? And so what are some of those higher risks? Being a child of a gambling parent or parent with SUD or mental health history. We know that there's correlations, there's intersections there. The belief that strategy is the key to winning. Having a big win at an early age, it's almost like that first, like, oh my God, I gotta experience that. The likelihood that that happens again is not high, but people are chasing after that initial feeling of that big win. That feeling that you got to keep playing so that you can gain what you've lost. High stakes betting, borrowing to play, right? And again, the presence of comorbidities directly, right? So I've had a history of this. I have a problem with this. I'm seeking care for this. And then this happens to be another one of the elements that's on the table, and how that increases your risk because that element of losing control, it's there. When it comes to, again, the structural determinants of health, it was mentioned earlier, right? When that person goes out and spends more than they should, that impacts the home. And so we need to understand the conditions, not only in the immediate environment, but in the systems that we live in, that we're part of, that we work and play and worship, right? Because at the end of the day, it's about quality of life. And gambling is a public health issue. It's something that we all need to understand. And I don't know if many, I believe some of you might have heard of recovery capital, right? So if I'm a person in recovery, there are certain elements that if they are present in my life, and the more of those things that I have, the higher the probability that I'm going to be able to do well and engage in long-term recovery and have a fruitful, productive, increased quality of life. If I have a job, if I have a partner, if I have children are in my life, I have a strong social community, all of those things make a difference. So when we think of social determinants of health, we need to think of it in a similar way. All of these systems play a part in how we show up, right? And what we feel and what we think. And so the stronger the systems that we are part of are, the better the outcomes for us, because we're going into systems that see us, that understand us, and are able to engage and work with us. When we're engaging with systems that do not see us, that do not have services that can care for us, that don't understand our cultural values, then we end up disconnected from systems that are critical to our well-being and survival, right? And oftentimes, especially in our community, that decision might be made by one person, but it's going to impact the entire family. I had a bad experience with that provider, so we're no longer going to see a therapist anymore. Even though I have a child with anxiety, even though my wife is suffering from depression, and there's other pieces, and the system could benefit as a whole because of my experience, I've made a collective choice for the entire family that is not good for us, right? And so it's important for us to understand that how people engage with the system is invaluable. I don't want to focus too much on this, but I left it there for a reason because the numbers are similar in Connecticut. when we talk about social determinants of health, and we talk about how large of a demographic the Hispanic-Latine population is, it's staggering to me, and many of us who do this work in public health and social work, whether you're looking at prevention, treatment, intervention, that the stats continue to stack against people in our community. The median wage in Massachusetts is significantly lower for the Latino Hispanic population than non-Latino whites. A huge gap there. Home ownership, huge gap. You're talking about 31% compared to 71% of non-Latino whites. Lack of insurance and access to care, pivotal. And yet so many people in our community are still experiencing lack of insurance. Without insurance, you can't access resources, right? Never mind accessing quality resources. And oftentimes people think that the lack of insurance is connected to a migration issue or an immigrant issue. It's not. People are losing insurance because they're retired and now they make a little bit more than they should. I've worked with families that have lost their insurance because they decided to buy life insurance because they didn't want to leave the weight of a burial on a loved one. And that is now considered, right, income. And all of a sudden that moves them over the threshold and they no longer have life insurance, right? Or they no longer have insurance. They end up having to go to someone that can help them navigate that. They have to sign that insurance off to a funeral provider so that it doesn't show up on income for them. It baffles me that people have to do that kind of thing for doing what we encourage people to do, to take care of themselves and their families. The poverty rate is 1 in 4 in households in Massachusetts. Again, the numbers are very similar. We continue to have the highest percentage of individuals without a high school diploma, although the numbers continue to change and rise. It's still an area that we need to recognize, and there continues to be significant food insecurity. So when all of these things are present and happening in many of the communities, not all, then it's hard for people to want to get informed and educated and connect about anything else. And so that's where understanding then what are our values and how we engage helps, because you have to be strategic and you have to be intentional with how you engage with people. In Latino Hispanic communities, the aspect of el colectivo, the collective, is really important. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps and you can do this kind of mentality. In many of our households, that's not the case. Without my family, I can't do this. Without my partner, I can't do this. Without my social system, I can't do it. And so there's a heavy importance placed on community and others in our community. We just can't say, you know what? There's a saying, ojos que no ven, corazón que no siente. Eyes that do not see, heart that doesn't feel. We can't look away because the collective is invaluable to us. And so when we're serving the community, we need to understand that you can't expect this traditional way of, well, I can only talk to you, and if someone in your family wants to talk to me, they have to sign a release of information. I'm not saying don't violate HIPAA, but I'm saying be more open and willing to engage those people, because you're not going to engage the individual without that collective. That collective brings value, right? The element of respeto, respect, right? Oftentimes people, yep, I'm gonna say that I agree even if I don't. I'm gonna say that I understand even if I don't, because authority means something to us. And so there's this element of, ay, yo no le voy a faltar el respeto al doctor o la doctora. I can't tell you how many times I've, in the community, when I was working as an independent clinician, I kept being called all the time by people that I was working with, la doctora. And they would say to, right, other family, esa mi doctora, even though I would say, if I ever see you in the community, I won't approach you, I want to protect you. They were comfortable with saying, no, esta mi doctora. And I had to educate, like, no, I'm not your doctor, I'm your therapist, and this is what that means. But that's just the element of respect that comes from that. And then there's this sort of resiliency, right? The strength that collective experience and trauma survival brings to the table. right? And that is an important piece to understand, because that's where trauma-informed care comes into the picture, right? Understanding that, yes, there's a lot of intergenerational trauma, but there's a lot of resiliency and collective strength. And how do we tap into that? And how do we display that in any of the advertisements and things that we have out there? Because that's how we engage the community. There's also a few other aspects around cultural constructs. There's the concept of familismo, right? Sort of that emphasis, similar to the collective being an important value to us, that emphasis on family loyalty and unity and responsibility. Not only sort of the nuclear family, so my initial blood relatives, but you know what? Who I grew up with. We have tons of primos and primas that are not blood related. We have tons of aunts and uncles that are not blood relatives. And so there's a lot of value in that extended family. And so to the right, you'll have, right, what are some of those implications in practice, right? Engaging families in decision making, framing services as supporting that collective, right? When you understand the value, then you're better able to say, okay, well, what's the strategy that I'm going to pull into here? The essence of personalismo, valuing sort of warmth and relationships and personal relationships and respect is really important. We have a lot of tools. Oops, sorry about that. We have a lot of tools. My computer froze and I'm trying to hit backwards now. Excuse the continue. Thank you, Holly. I saw that you were trying to. So the personalismo is important, right? And I learned this at a very young professional age. I remember being a very young clinician and learning in school, like, you want to keep your office very limited and you don't want personal pictures and you don't want, and it felt so impersonal. And I realized that there was a barrier when I was trying to engage, whether it be the community, an individual, when I began to bring my authentic self and I gave myself permission to demonstrate who I was as a person, and then layered in all of the other professional stuff, I connected better with people. And I realized, like, oh, wow, right? The barrier that I had created that I was told was the right way, and how dismantling that approach changed engagement. And I'm not saying go for it and share all of your personal business. I'm saying, office space matters, and cultural things in your office matter, and how you engage with people matter. If you have to fill a questionnaire, we get it, but maybe have some small talk first. Maybe say, you know what, God, it's so cold out there, right? I was so looking forward to, having a warm day, and engage on the small stuff first, and then say, now I want to bring us back. I want to make sure that we get to this. That will make a world of a difference when engaging with folks. There's the element of simpatia, right? Kindness and harmony. This is where we use affirming communication. We're mindful of the tone. Tone matters. A person can sense very quickly whether they're going to like you or not based on your tone, based on, again, your visual, based on your body language. And so pay attention to some of that stuff, because what, to someone else may be very minimal. Well, I don't care how she said it. What matters to me is what she said. And some of our communities know, well, you know what she said doesn't match with how she said it, right? It's the opposite. And so how do we understand that difference? And then there's the element of machismo and marianismo, right? Sort of machismo being that traditional view of male strength, protection, and authority. And it's not always negative. I think machismo constantly gets at, aggression and control, but there's also sort of this desire to be the provider, to be the caretaker, to be the head, right? And so how do we balance both? How do we affirm cultural values while dismantling gender roles that are not healthy, right? In an authentic way. And the same with Marianismo, right? Sort of idealizing sort of that self-sacrifice, purity, nurturing role that we bring as women, which again, there's many positives to that. But at what stake, right? Do I have to sacrifice myself for my family? Well, you shouldn't have to. And so how do we honor that your family is important and that is a value for you, while also saying, but so are you. And so how do we work with you, right? And so it's drawing sort of that parallel and being able to look at both of those elements openly. So here are then some effective interventions for, again, individuals experiencing gambling. And I'll talk in general, and then I'll move into specifically more of the cultural piece. It's still, for a lot of people, a lot of frustration that there's not enough services and care. And yes, there's hotlines and there's a lot more information. But still, for some people, they're still thinking I can send my loved one somewhere and they're going to go privately for several days and they're going to come back and they're going to be fixed, right? We still have that false sense of belief, even on the addiction side of things, right? Not really understanding how the process works and that there's many elements of recovery and many pathways to recovery and of recovery, right? And so in problem gambling is the same. And so the strategies that we do know work is sort of traditional, right? CBT happens to be one of those main strategies also for working with other addictions. Why? Because we're challenging sort of distorted beliefs. Because we're leveraging motivational interviewing to increase client engagement. And add to that, right, maybe a bilingual clinician, a culturally affirming person, and you get even better success with some of those interventions. Group therapy and peer support continue to be very powerful tools when working with our populations. First, we need to destigmatize the group therapy and the fear that people feel that what I say there is going to be something that the whole community is going to be aware of. And then how do we build from some of that strength? If I know that someone else do it, then I'm going to be more hopeful that I can. And it doesn't mean that I have to follow the path that they took. It means that I can find my own path. And so I don't have to tell you where you're going to go, but maybe walking with you might make you feel stronger, right? And more willing to engage. Using family-centered interventions, right? I think one, it reduces relational harm, intergenerational behavior, and it again increases and builds support systems. The reality is that many families are tired, they're drained, they love their person, but they don't want to deal with the behavior anymore. So how do you empower and also give the family the skill, the resource, and the information so that they're supporting with love without feeling that they're adding to the problem, and they know when to step in and when to step out in a loving, healthy way, right? How do they take care of both of those elements? Financial counseling, also super important, and adding to that sort of that holistic approach, right? Sort of behavioral interventions as well, educating people. It also baffles me to this day how many people still don't have the basics on credit scores, and the fact that, you know, if you don't have a strong financial background, that's going to impact whether you're able to get an apartment, whether you can get a job. Sometimes young people don't really think that far out. And so when you address it with the individual, you're also addressing it with the entire family, and you begin to see transformation. I strongly believe that that's how you change generational traumas, that's how you change, right, behaviors that get passed on from one generation to the other. You begin to address one and you bring in the rest of that community, you hold them safely, and you provide the information. And in due time, people will respond to what they're receiving when it's received in a way that they feel that it's speaking to them and their culture. Risk reduction, right, for some, similar to SUD interventions. For certain people, it may not be, you know what, you're not going to engage in any gambling, but let's begin to at least work on some of that, reducing the risk. Maybe you're not going to play alone. Maybe you're going to have a given amount of money that you're going to use. It's not about what we want. It's about what works best for the individual and how they're going to be able to improve their quality of life, right? Because at the end of the day, their quality of life improvements improves the quality of life of their families. Having those multilingual tools, having those screening tools that, again, are not just translated in different languages, but are taking into consideration the cultural values and constructs of the community that they're translated for. And then, of course, you have some of the digital supports as well. You have the hotlines and other resources that people can engage in. As a matter of fact, there's even artists across the world that have used their experience and have created educational applications, so that people in their community can tap into. J Balvin, for example, promoted an application to help people manage anxiety and depression. And he came out and talked about his own anxiety and depression. And when you think of an artist like him, people are, I can't believe it, but it's true. And more artists and people of impact are coming out and saying, you're not alone. I've also experienced that. And I've also experienced that. But not only are they saying it, they're putting their money behind it. And they're creating tools to help support their communities. I'm not as familiar with Connecticut, but I know in Massachusetts, you have apps like Gamban and Bet Blocker, right, where people can voluntarily go in and select to remove themselves from certain things, and not be able to download certain applications in their phones, so that there's many interventions that work. Here are other strategies, right? There's no one size fits all. And I want to pay attention to the time because I want to give you guys enough time to Q&A. But these are some more sort of collective community strategies, right? Understanding sort of the impact of SDOH in the community in general, making sure that we're always sort of using person-centered approaches, but remain adaptable and flexible, right? Again, there isn't a one size fits all. Engaging community members and leaders. You can't talk about people without people in the room, right? Who know I am the expert in my life. Holly's the expert in her life. Joanna's the expert in her life. And we may have similar experiences, but I'm still me and they are still them. And so how do we make sure that we bring that lived and living experience value to the table, and that in our effort of wanting to help, that we get so caught up in that savior mentality that we're doing all of the planning and all of the leading and all of the creating, and no one stopped to ask the community, did you want this? Will you come to this? Will you participate? And then when no one shows, we do, what do? We say, well, you know what? That's a disengaged community. They just don't want the services. Did you ever ask what services they wanted and how they wanted them? Instead of now labeling them as disengaged and hard to reach and we can't seem to engage or work with, we need to understand how our own systems can create some of these pieces. Celebrating and welcome cultural diversity, making sure that there's representation across the workforce. And I know now more than ever, people get really funky about this. Well, what do you mean we need to have? And it's like, you know what? Let's remember our humanity and why we do the work. And this is not about politics or what people believe or don't believe. At the end of the day, we know, and research shows that when we are engaging in care, we feel better when we can relate to the person that's in front of us. It's as simple as that. So how do we continue to make sure that we don't lose some of that in our current political landscape? Because it is impacting the work that we do, the services that are getting funded, and it's going to take a lot of intentional advocacy to make sure that we don't lose some of the strides that we've been able to gain in some of the work that we're doing, right? Because that's how we create safe, welcoming environments. That's how we counter stigma. That's how we, unpack shame and really give words to feelings and thoughts that people never really understand. We are hope brokers. That really is who we are. And I think someone, said it spot on right in the beginning, right? It's sort of this element of hope, engaging families, practicing cultural humility. It is so important. It goes a long way. And then, of course, there's formal things that you can do. You can implement class standards. There's other strategies. There's tons of workbooks out there. A lot of things that you can engage in to help support some of what you're doing. In Massachusetts, again, well, not Massachusetts. You have New England ATTC, right, which serves the New England area. Tons of great resources, available trainings for free. There's the elements on cultural values that I mentioned earlier. They have a whole session, right? And so we need to be intentional as providers And we need to say, you know what, being able to show up in my community and serve with intention calls for me making professional development a priority, for me making learning a priority, right? And that means constantly, I am constantly looking for ways to engage and learn and get additional training, even if it's training that I've done. I've done plenty of gambling trainings, and yet I sit on the other side of those gambling trainings because a colleague may bring something in a context that I didn't, or they may have a different understanding. And every single time, it's an opportunity for new learning because there's different people in the room. And so I bring a little bit of experience to this conversation, but I know all of you have a lot of experience as well. There's 19 other people in this virtual presentation. And I know I am not the only one, right, with some experience. I have some, but so do you. And it's that collective learning that I think really pushes us along as a workforce, as a community when it comes to helping others. Massachusetts also has the page for careers of substance. I couldn't find a similar link in Connecticut. I know that there's CCAR and there's other areas that you can go to for professional development. I know that there's websites that you can go to for access to free training. So I did my best to kind of put those links for Connecticut on the opposite side of Massachusetts. And again, I left them both because these are resources that are cross-serving our communities. So it's important to understand on both sides and to, visit each other's communities and understand how these communities kind of show up and play out. I am going to stop my share of the slides because I love looking at people. And I am super excited that we finished with a little bit of time left over. I actually deleted quite a few slides so that we can have, again, Q&A. I would love to hear additional comments. I know that people spoke earlier. I read some comments. I'm going to take a peek, make sure that I didn't miss anything. But this is an opportunity, again, for more discussion. I would love to hear the prevalence, what people are seeing. If you're doing work, is this work that you're doing? Is it work that you want to do better, right? And what are you seeing in many of the spaces that you're working in? Even in Department of Corrections, I don't know if there's any representation here in terms of Department of Corrections, but we know that, these behaviors don't stop when you hit, when you're behind the walls. If anything, at times they exacerbate because then the stakes are higher, right? I'll give you this cigarette for that. And you know what, I'm going to get commissary on X time. And, if you give me this, I'll make sure when I get, and so there's that stuff is happening all of the time. People bartering, right, for services that they bring to the table. So I'll kind of just pause for a moment, take a sip, and open it up to the room for any comments. And please don't be shy.
I'll add something, just something that I notice. I live in a very diverse neighborhood, and would probably be considered a lower income neighborhood. So there's a lot of convenience stores, corner markets, things like that. And there's a lot of scratch tickets thrown out around the neighborhood, thrown out in the streets that have not been used. And it always makes me think that what are our young people thinking about it when they see it, and what are we communicating to them? And so it's just something that I think about. What are the kids seeing as they're walking to and from school? That we as adults are normalizing this behavior for them in some way, that this is an activity that happens in our community here. And as I said, it's a very, very diverse community. And so I'm always wondering, what do kids think and what are we communicating? I see Haley has her hand up.
Yeah, thank you for that, Holly. I was going to say too, I'm surprised by how much more we see, and you see this like with TikTok and all these, right? Social media has become such a prominent figure for many of us around the holidays. How many little kids are getting scratch tickets as gifts, right? And stocking stuffers, and the danger of that, right? Without obviously the intention isn't there, but the lack of information and the danger of that, it's baffling. Yeah.
Haley?
Haley?
Yeah, no, agree with just want to echo everything you said and thank you for being here. And I think, you said it best too. It's just like we relate, to folks from our, communities, to family, to just getting the message out there, like peer to peer, and really being, you know, culturally, I don't know if it's sensitive, or just knowing our communities we're going into before engaging them. And like you said too, it's, just hosting an event and then being upset no one comes. It's like, well, let's reach folks, where they're at, and let's better understand. And just thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Anyone else? Any other comments, questions?
I
I'll
wanted
jump
to
in.
share something.
Yes, Joanna. I think it was Joanna and someone else. Was it you, Laura?
It might have been me, and I have some background noise, so I might just end up putting it in the chat. I just wanted to thank you for this really valuable presentation for me personally, but also for the work that I do, and let you know, but also let people know. The initiative that I'm with is part of Wheeler, and we're funded by DCF and by DEMIS, but the work we do is with youth, young adults, and families throughout Connecticut. We're called Youth Recovery CT. I'm not trying to promote us, but I wanted to give you the context because we work with training people to become smart recovery facilitators, and smart recovery could be a great resource on your resource list. And there's also smart recovery in Espanol, which is a whole series of meetings, smart recovery meetings, which is all about any kind of behavior change. So it's not just about substances, but it can encompass gambling. It can encompass, scrolling too much, or too much impulsive buying, for example, compulsive shopping, and so forth. So it just could be a great resource where people can, find that camaraderie. And we work with youth, young adults, and families, but it's for adults and people of all ages. And I'm happy to send you resources or put them in the chat just so that people are aware of what smart recovery is, and we're trying to expand those Spanish groups in Connecticut. So I just thought that was appropriate to let you know that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. And you're right, it
You're
could
welcome.
definitely be one of those resources added. I'm happy to add the links, Holly, and resend the PowerPoint to you for sharing. Because again, I mentioned CCAR as well, right? Connecticut Addiction for Recovery Center. And they do a lot of training and work as well, right? They help build recovery coaching, and there's a lot of gambling support with recovery coaches. And so, that I know Massachusetts has a project called the Ambassador Project. And so I know that they've done work with CCAR and some of that. And so I can definitely add those to pieces. And yes, smart recovery is, and anything that can be led in Spanish is invaluable, completely invaluable. So thank you for that. And right, never be. I think networking and resource sharing is how we get it done, because resources are limited, or we just don't know what they are, right? Because we haven't looked that way. We're really caught up in sort of the work that we're doing. So anytime that there's a group of professionals coming together, seeking similar knowledge, is always a great platform to say, hey, we do this. Let me share that with you. Or, you know what, I know of this. Networking is instrumental for us being able to be effective providers. So thank you. Joanna, and I don't know if Haley, you had another comment, or if your hand just stood up.
Oh, sorry, I just didn't lower it.
Okay, all right. Joanna?
I just wanted to thank you for such a thoughtful presentation. And thank you, Laura. The question that I had, it was sort of trying to figure out more resources. I work with Wheeler and in the Better Choice program. It's adult outpatient. And my peer, who is also on the call, we were researching Spanish GA meetings, and we only found one, and that's in California. So that was a little bit eye-opening for us that those resources are limited. So we'll definitely be looking into smart recovery. And mostly because we treat adults, and sometimes if we do get a younger person who is gambling or even gaming, then there's something out there too. recommend.
Mm. Thank you so much, Joanna. And again, if anybody else has other resources that they can share either with Joanna or the group, feel free to send them to Holly. I'm happy to add them to the links that were already included in the presentation, because again, they are limited. You know, I know in Massachusetts, and I don't know, I can always double check. There's a model that has been going around called group peer support, and it's a training that is helping build leadership around leading trauma-informed groups. And it started specifically for mothers, pregnant mothers, right, suffering from postpartum depression, and it's sort of evolved into this work that is now working with people in recovery and the Latino community. It happens in Spanish and English. There's certification trainings, but really it's just around building group facilitation skills, right? Because anytime that we have a group of people that are interested in something, there's an opportunity to provide information. But how do we do that, right, in an intentional, safe, trauma-informed way, so that we're creating spaces that are bringing healing and not further perpetuating harm, right? There's a lot of harm out there, sometimes with good intention, but it's still what it is. And so how do we continue to drive people towards resources that are going to be promoting healing and growth and transformation, especially intergenerational growing and healing?
Any other comments or questions? Sandra, the presentation was wonderful. There was so much information that's going to be helpful both in the prevention and treatment fields you're getting a lot of applause. I hope you can see these coming up in the screen. Okay.
Yes, I can. Thank you.
It's the information and the resources you gave are going to be so helpful in the work that we do in terms of planning, prevention programming, clinical treatment programming. It's given us a lot to think about. Every time I think one of the things I always think we think we've reached a level where we know a lot, but then we realize we really don't know very much at all. We have to keep growing and learning, and there's always things changing and always new resources coming out and always new ways to communicate information to communities. So I think it was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you all, right, for your participation, for your engagement. To your point, Holly, I always say common sense is not that common, right? And sometimes we just we don't know what we don't know, and it's okay to say that, as long as we're walking towards awareness. So again, I love being able to come together with different groups, across the state, across the country. So thank you for the invite. And of course, have a great rest of your day, all of you.
Thank you. You too.
Take care.
Take care, everybody. I'm going to grab the links. Well, I work with Laura, so I can get the links from Laura.
Okay, perfect.
See if there's anything else.
I'd be happy to just plug them in and add the few that I mentioned as well.
Okay, you're getting one of the best trainings I have ever attended. Are you seeing this?
No.
I'm going to read them all to you in case you're missing them.
Okay.
Excellent presentation. Thank you. I'm going to stop recording too before I forget. Excellent presentation. One of the best trainings I've ever attended. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. So many thank yous. Awesome presentation. Thank you. Just wonderful.
Nice. I'm glad it was well received. And like I said, Holly, thank you for the invite. It was a pleasure for me. It was fun. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll let me stop this.